Don't rely on social media. Put it down, turn it off, shut up, be quiet, learn, read, relax, get better. First part of your life you learn, second part of your life you earn, third part of your life you return.
Don't rely on social media. Put it down, turn it off, shut up, be quiet, learn, read, relax, get better. The first part of your life is for learning, the second part is for earning, and the third part is for returning. Denzel Washington has spent more than 4 decades appearing unbreakable, not only on screen, but in real life as well. While Hollywood has often collapsed under scandal, ego, and excess, he has remained steady, disciplined, and nearly untouchable, a man who moves with faith, restraint, and a quiet kind of dignity that feels rare today. Yet what most people never see is the hidden cost of living that way for so long. Discipline is not always peace. Sometimes it is armor, and sometimes it is simply a way to survive pain you never learned how to speak about. Now, at 71, the question is no longer how high Denzel climbed, but what still follows him into the quiet moments after the applause. What weight has he carried since childhood, the kind that never appears in award speeches? What did fame never heal? What did success never fix? And what parts of his life demanded a price even he could not control? So what is really closing in on Denzel Washington at 71? And why do so many people who admire him still sense a sadness behind that calm? If Denzel Washington has ever inspired you with his strength, integrity, or humanity, take a moment to honor that legacy by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Denzel Washington was born on December 28, 1954, in Mount Vernon, New York, a working-class town where faith and hardship existed side by side. From the outside, his home appeared structured, disciplined, and almost protected by routine. But inside, something essential was slowly breaking apart. His mother, Lenny's, ran a small beauty salon. Day after day, she stood on her feet for hours, her hands moving non-stop, carrying the weight of 3 children on her shoulders. She was strength in motion, practical, loving, and relentless, the kind of woman who never talked much about sacrifice because she simply did not have time to stop. His father, Reverend Denzel Hayes Washington Sr., was a Pentecostal minister and a city employee who believed deeply in order, scripture, and discipline. Prayer framed the house and rules shaped daily life, but affection was scarce. Love was implied rather than expressed, and authority spoke louder than warmth. As a child, Denzel learned early that silence could feel heavier than anger. There were no dramatic fights or explosive scenes. The fracture came quietly, through 2 adults growing apart under the same roof and 2 belief systems pulling in opposite directions. When his parents divorced in 1968, Denzel was only 14 years old. He stayed with his mother, while his father gradually faded from daily life, not through cruelty, but through distance. That absence left a mark that never announced itself. Denzel would later admit that he did not know how to describe the pain because there were no words for something that never fully existed. No hugs to miss, no conversations to mourn, only a space where connection should have been. That quiet lack followed him forward and shaped his restraint, his seriousness, and his instinct to carry everything alone. Long before Hollywood ever tested him, Denzel Washington had already learned how to stand upright inside emotional distance by the time he reached his mid-teens. The quiet absence left by his father had begun to pull him toward dangerous gravity. Mount Vernon in the late 1960s was not gentle to boys without direction. The streets offered instant belonging, a fast identity, and consequences that came later. The friends he ran with chased reputation, toughness, and survival. And some would eventually disappear into prison sentences measured in decades. Years later, Denzel said it plainly. The guys he grew up with did 40 years combined. They went one way, and he went another. At the time, that difference felt accidental, but in truth, it was intervention. His mother saw what he could not yet name. She watched his posture change, his temper sharpen, and his attention drift. Fear pushed her toward a decision that felt cruel on the surface, but proved life-saving underneath. She sent him away to Oakland Military Academy in New Windsor. New York, at 14, it felt like abandonment. The first nights were brutal cold mornings, boots striking pavement before sunrise, and orders shouted by strangers who had no concern for his feelings. He lay awake in a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to footsteps echo through hallways that smelled of starch and discipline. There were no family voices and no comfort, only routine. Yet inside that rigidity, something unexpected formed. Structure replaced chaos, and discipline replaced drift. He learned control under pressure, restraint instead of reaction, and endurance without applause. For the first time, consequences were immediate and clear, and for the first time, he felt himself stabilizing. Years later, Denzel would say something that reframed his entire life. He believed his mother saved his life. She did it not with affection or explanation, but with action. That decision did not erase his wounds, but it gave him a foundation, and from that foundation, different men began to emerge. When Denzel left military academy and stepped into adulthood, stability did not automatically follow him. In the early 1970s, he enrolled at Fordham University in New York, carrying discipline but very little certainty. College was not a fresh start filled with optimism. It was survival in another form. Money was scarce, winters were unforgiving, and some nights he went to sleep hungry, counting the hours until morning just to outrun the ache in his stomach. He worked wherever hands were needed, cleaning, serving, doing anything that kept him afloat. His mother's salon back home barely covered its own bills, so pride had no place in his decisions. He learned how to endure quietly and without complaint. At that point, Denzel did not dream of acting. He did not even know who he was supposed to become. He later admitted that he was simply trying to stay afloat, hoping that direction would eventually find him. Then, in the summer of 1975, something small changed everything. While working as a counselor at a YMCA camp in Lakeville, New York, a talent show suddenly lost its performer. On impulse, Denzel stepped in. He had no preparation and no expectations, only instinct. The room reacted immediately. Children leaned forward. Laughter filled the space, and when it ended, a woman in the audience looked directly at him and said words that would echo for decades. "You were born to act." What struck him was not praise, but recognition. Something clicked. He returned to Fordham, changed, switched his major to drama, and for the first time in his life felt an alignment between effort and purpose. He graduated in 1977 leaner, tougher, and awake. He still did not know how hard the road ahead would be, but he finally knew where it led. Graduation brought not relief, but risk. With a degree in drama and almost no safety net, Denzel stepped fully into a life defined by uncertainty. A scholarship carried him west to the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, but opportunity came with a price. The city was cold, expensive, and indifferent. His rented room was bare. The walls held no warmth, and some nights bread and tap water were all he had. He rehearsed lines under dim lights, repeating them until the words steadied his breathing. The ocean wind cut through cracked windows and into his bones. Yet, when he stood under stage lights, something strange happened. The cold disappeared. For the first time, he felt present and alive. Acting was not escape. It was alignment. After a year, he returned to New York with a suitcase, a worn Bible, and no guarantees. What followed were years of auditions that ended in the same empty promise. "We'll call you." They didn't. Days blurred into waiting rooms, thick with stale coffee and quiet disappointment. Nights were spent on couches, borrowed floors, and anywhere that allowed him to show up again the next morning. He was not homeless, but he learned what it meant to belong nowhere. Every rejection felt final, yet something inside him refused to stop showing up. Small roles came and went enough to survive, never enough to relax. He carried hunger forward, both physical and emotional. What sustained him was faith and a growing belief that patience was not passive, but active endurance. He was not chasing fame. He was chasing truth, and slowly, almost invisibly, the industry began to notice the man who never quit. Denzel Washington's breakthrough did not come with noise. It came with consistency. Small roles began stacking quietly in the early 1980s. And each performance carried weight because he treated even the smallest part as testimony. He was not interested in being visible. He was interested in being true. As opportunities grew, so did temptation. In 1986, before his name carried real power, Denzel was offered a role that promised momentum but demanded something in return. The script leaned on distortion. It reduced dignity for effect. It would have opened doors quickly and paid well, but it would also have cost him something he could not recover. At that moment, he sought counsel from Sidney Poitier, a man who had already walked the road he was just beginning to enter. The advice was simple and devastatingly clear. Your early choices will tell the world who you are. Denzel turned the role down. That decision slowed his rise. Some rooms went quiet, and some calls stopped coming. But what remained was alignment. He chose principle over speed, faith over fear, and identity over opportunity. Years later, he would say that decision cost him work but saved his life. When success finally arrived through roles like Glory and later Malcolm X, it was earned, not borrowed. He did not bend to the industry. The industry bent toward him. With each step upward, he carried the weight of that early refusal as proof that integrity could survive Hollywood. By the time Denzel Washington reached the top of Hollywood, the world saw certainty, awards, prestige, and authority. What it did not see was the relentless weight that came with never being allowed to fall. At the highest level, mistakes are no longer forgiven, they are remembered. For a man who built his name on discipline and truth, the pressure to remain unwavering became its own burden. Film sets stretched into 16-hour days. Preparation did not end when the cameras stopped. Scripts followed him into the night. Lines were rehearsed in silence, not for applause, but to ensure that he never arrived unprepared. Sleep shortened, and rest became conditional. The higher his reputation climbed, the smaller his margin for weakness became. There was also isolation, not the dramatic kind, but the subtle kind that settles into hotel rooms and late-night trailers. People admired him, but few truly knew him. Success attracted voices, expectations, and dependence. He learned to carry responsibility quietly, refusing to let exhaustion show and refusing to let doubt leak outward. Denzel has often said that fame is not the enemy. Distraction is. To survive, he returned constantly to first principles: faith, routine, and purpose. He reminded himself why he started and, more importantly, who he refused to become. The cost of greatness, he learned, was not paid in money or awards. It was paid in time, silence, and the discipline to remain grounded when everything around you pushes toward excess. In an industry where relationships often collapse under the weight of ambition, Denzel Washington's marriage stands as a quiet anomaly. It has not been perfect nor untouched by strain, but it has endured. He met Pauletta Pearson in 1977, long before fame had any meaning. He was uncertain, struggling, and unknown. She was steady, intelligent, and grounded in music and faith. Their connection did not begin with spectacle. It began with conversation, shared values, and two people trying to survive rather than impress. They married on June 25, 1983, when money was tight and the future was unclear. Their early years were marked by small apartments, late rent, and hope held together by prayer. A piano filled their home with sound, while scripts lay scattered across tables. There was little comfort, but there was rhythm. When Denzel's career exploded, the balance shifted. Film schedules pulled him away for months at a time. 16-hour days became normal, and applause replaced presence. At home, Pauletta carried what success could not: children's structure, stability, and faith. Denzel has openly admitted that while he worked, she raised the family. There were moments when distance tested everything, and moments when silence felt heavier than conflict. In 1995, they renewed their vows in South Africa, not as performance, but as recommitment, a pause, and a decision to stay. Denzel later said their secret was simple but difficult: pray more than you argue, and choose patience over pride. In a world that constantly pulls people apart, Pauletta became the anchor that kept him from drifting into the very emptiness he feared most. In 1991, while filming Malcolm X, Denzel Washington received news that should have shattered him. His father had died. The reaction surprised even him. There were no tears, no collapse, and no visible grief, not because love was absent, but because closeness had never fully existed. His father had been a man of scripture, order, a responsibility, a Pentecostal minister, a provider, present in duty yet distant in emotion. Sermons filled the house and discipline ruled the days, but affection was rare and nearly unsaid. So when death came, Denzel felt something harder to name: a loss without vocabulary, grief without release. He later admitted that he didn't cry because there had never been a relationship deep enough to mourn in the traditional sense. What hurt was not what ended, but what never quite began. He returned to set and continued filming. To the world, he was delivering one of the most powerful performances of his career. Off camera, he was carrying unresolved questions. Did my father love me? Did he know who I became? Could things have been different? Over time, reflection softened the pain. Denzel came to understand that his father's love had simply taken a form shaped by restraint and responsibility. It was imperfect, but it still built part of the foundation he stood on. From that realization, Denzel made a quiet vow. He would not repeat the same distance. He would be present. He would say the words his father never said. He would build a home where silence was not the primary language. That promise shaped the man he became as a parent, not loud or performative, but consistently and intentionally there. The absence he once carried became the motivation to give his children something he himself never had. As Denzel Washington grew older, loss stopped arriving as shock and instead came as a reminder. In 2012, the death of Whitney Houston hit him harder than he ever expected. They had shared the screen in The Preacher's Wife and were bonded by faith, discipline, and an understanding of how fame can quietly suffocate. Whitney was light, laughter, and an almost supernatural voice. But behind that brilliance lived exhaustion, pressure, and a loneliness the world rarely acknowledged. When she died, Denzel was haunted by a single thought: I assumed there would be more time. He spoke carefully about her, never sensationalizing her pain. He didn't judge, he grieved. He understood how the brightest smiles often hide the deepest fatigue. Her passing reinforced something already forming inside him. Talent does not protect you, applause does not heal you, and strength does not mean invincibility. Years later, history repeated itself in a quieter and more personal way. Chadwick Boseman was not just a colleague. He was someone Denzel had quietly supported years earlier by paying for his Oxford acting program without attaching his name or expecting recognition. Chadwick never forgot. When he later thanked Denzel publicly, the world finally learned about that act of generosity, and Denzel lowered his head, uncomfortable with praise. Because that had never been the point. When Chadwick died in 2020, Denzel was deeply shaken not only by the loss, but by the realization that Chadwick had carried his illness in silence. He endured years of pain, surgeries, and chemotherapy, yet still showed up every day with grace and dignity. "I didn't know," Denzel later admitted. "I never asked." That truth stayed with him. The regret was not dramatic, but it was heavy. It reminded him that even the strongest people may be fighting battles they never speak about. From that moment on, Denzel became even more intentional with kindness, more present, more attentive, and less assuming. Loss did not harden him. It refined him. For most of his life, Denzel Washington treated discipline as armor. He endured long shoots, little sleep, and a life of total control. His body followed his will, and for decades it obeyed without protest. But time does not announce itself loudly. It waits, and then it speaks. By the early 2010s, subtle changes began to surface. Fatigue lingered longer than it used to. Recovery required more patience. And movements that once felt automatic now required awareness. Denzel did not complain. He adjusted quietly, the same way he always had. Then, in 2013, his body forced a pause he could not negotiate around. He underwent a heart-related medical procedure, something he later described with restraint, calling it routine, manageable, and nothing dramatic. But behind that calm language was a private reckoning. For the first time, he lay still while machines monitored the rhythm that had carried him through decades of pressure. In that silence, he listened to his own heartbeat, not as a metaphor, but as reality. He later admitted that this moment changed him more than any award or role ever had. It was not fear that struck him, but clarity, the realization that strength is not permanent and control is always borrowed. Recovery forced him to move slower, to walk instead of rush, and to breathe instead of push. He began waking earlier, not to train harder, but to pray longer. Mornings were no longer preparation for conquest. They became gratitude for arrival. Each day felt earned rather than assumed. Denzel did not step away from work, but he stopped fighting time. He learned to work with it. Age, he realized, was not an enemy. It was a teacher. By the time Denzel Washington reached 71, the world had already decided how to measure him. Awards, box office numbers, prestige, and an estimated fortune built across decades of consistency and trust. On paper, it looked like total victory. But Denzel never treated wealth as proof of arrival. Having grown up inside instability, he understood something many people never learn. Comfort can disappear overnight. Money can amplify who you already are, but it cannot stabilize what was never grounded to begin with. So instead of using success to escape his past, he used it to correct it. His homes reflect that choice, not monuments to excess, but places designed for quiet, healing, and presence. They are spaces where mornings are slow, where scripture sits closer than trophies, and where family gathers without performance. For a man raised amid emotional distance, home became an act of repair rather than a reward. Though he owns luxury cars and properties, they are never displayed as conquest. He does not perform wealth. He contains it. His possessions remain tools rather than identity, movement without attachment, security without noise. Even more revealing is how he gives. Over the years, Denzel has quietly donated millions to universities, arts programs, churches, and scholarships for young performers, often without announcements, naming rights, or public gratitude. He believes generosity loses power when it seeks recognition. His life now moves by intention rather than urgency. He works selectively, mentors privately, speaks less, and listens longer. Strength to him is no longer about dominance. It is about steadiness. At this stage, success is not something he chases, but something he manages carefully so that it never manages him. Denzel Washington did not let wealth soften his discipline or fame dilute his values. Instead, He used both to build a quieter kind of authority, rooted not in visibility, but in restraint. At 71, Denzel Washington no longer stands as a man trying to prove anything to the world. That chapter closed long ago. What remains now is something rarer than fame and far more difficult to maintain than success: inner alignment. His life was shaped by absence before it was shaped by applause. A fractured home. A father who was present in structure but distant in warmth. And a mother who loved fiercely enough to send him away so that he could survive. Those early wounds never disappeared. They matured. They became discipline. They became restraint. They became a lifelong refusal to lose himself even when the world offered shortcuts. The tragedy of Denzel Washington is not collapse or scandal. It is quieter than that. It is the cost of carrying integrity in an industry that rewards compromise. It is the loneliness of long nights on set while family life continues without you. It is the ache of missing moments that cannot be rehearsed or replayed. It is the realization that greatness often demands distance from the very people who give life meaning. Yet this is also where the story transforms, because unlike so many before him, Denzel learned when to slow down, when to listen, and when to choose presence over momentum. He learned that strength does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like going home early. Sometimes it looks like silence. At 71, he walks differently, works differently, and prays differently, not because time weakened him, but because time clarified him. His legacy is not only the roles that will live forever on screen. It is also the quiet example of a man who refused to let success erase his values, who lifted others without needing credit, and who chose faith over fear.